This is the timeline explanation. You have been given a PDF of each one of these sets. You have a set of the entire timeline that you can tape together and do this project, just as we did on this table. You will need 3 crayons or markers. We're going to use red, green, and yellow or chartreuse. The red we're going to mark for the bad kings, or the ones who did evil in the sight of the Lord. The green we're going to use for the good kings, and the chartreuse or yellow we're going to use for the very good kings. What we're going to do is we're going to take this set of papers about the kings and prophets of Israel, and we're going to take the words where they say they are evil or good, and we're going to use this and color our timeline in. I'm going to talk you through these Old Testament scriptures in a conversation format. I'm going to tell you a story of the Old Testament. But this particular one, we see Saul is evil. It says Saul is evil here. Okay, so what do? We're going to take the red. I'm going to have my help do this. And we're going to take the red marker, and we're going to draw a red line right here to where David starts. And then we will do it. David was good, so we'll use green to Solomon, and we'll go down the line for this. As I talk through it, and both of you will look through here and study what is evil and what is good, and draw a line. Now the next one would be David and then Solomon. So figure out which one is good and evil, and go between the lines of the good and evil. As they're doing this and they're working on these, I want to talk through this paper of the Old Testament. Go. Let's talk through the history of the Old Testament timeline. Exodus means departure and begins where Genesis leaves off. And it traces the time that Israel entered Egypt as guests of Joseph to where they were delivered from the cruel bondage of slavery. Moses then led them out of Egypt and through the wilderness, but they did not enter the promised land. Now Joshua and Caleb entered the promised land, and they led them through many battles. Judges picks up where Joshua leaves off. And at the end of Judges, we find that people wanted a king. They wanted to be like other countries that were surrounding them. They asked Gideon to be the ruler. And everybody did what was right in their own eyes. Then entered Samuel. Samuel comes in as a judge, and the last judge and prophet. He anoints Saul as king, and Saul is a king for 40 years. We see that David then came after Saul, and then his son Solomon is ruling. If you note in your papers that I have given you, the basic Old Testament timeline with scriptures, you can read about Solomon, who is David and Bathsheba's son, who becomes king. Now the thing that you want to realize here with Solomon, why was there a change after Solomon? You notice that the kingdom divides into two. We have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Let's look and see what happened during Solomon's reign that precipitated the division of the kingdoms. Solomon was up on the mountain, and he was sacrificing. He began to sacrifice. Now, it was the same point where you could sacrifice to an idol or sacrifice to God. There was no difference in the place at that time. They didn't have that established during the time that he was sacrificing. So he sacrificed to God and a lot of animals, and he sacrificed and fell asleep, and God asked him, "What do you want, Solomon?" And Solomon says, "I would like to have wisdom." So God gives him wisdom. Well, I believe with all my heart, why did God appear to him in a dream? Why did God ask him what did he want? Well, the reason why God asked him what he wanted, because Solomon had a choice to sacrifice to idols or to sacrifice to God. And at that moment, he sacrificed to God. And God says to him, if you will sacrifice to me, if you will come to me and ask me, I will give you anything. Don't go to these idols. I am worthy. Just ask me. And Solomon says, yeah, okay. But he didn't get it. He didn't get it. Later, he ended up marrying different people, different women who caused him to sacrifice to the wrong gods. The main deal here was sacrificing to God, and to be not just sacrificing to God, but honoring God first. Well, he sees God a couple times, and then what happens? He still disobeys him. We don't have a choice. He sees him face to face, and here he is, and there we have it, and he still disobeyed him. And so the kingdoms divide. In 1 Kings 11:26, his son Rehoboam and Jeroboam get into a little issue here. Jeroboam, actually, a prophet appears to Jeroboam. Jeroboam is someone who worked for Solomon. He worked for Solomon, and he was a man who was a very honorable and I believe a noble man, a man who knew what he was doing, very skilled at what he did. And so Jeroboam, a prophet comes along and tells him that the kingdoms are going to be ripped from Rehoboam, who is the son of Solomon. And why is that? It's because Solomon didn't obey God. He didn't obey God. And so not in Solomon's time, God waited for his child. So what happens? Jeroboam ends up with 10 of the tribes. And how did that happen? Here we talk about it, actually, the actual split is in 1 Kings 12:1. How did it actually split? Well, the split came about because Rehoboam goes up and he's getting ready to take over the kingdoms. And what happens, he talks to the older men, the men who are wise. This is after his dad, the men who advised his father. And he asked him, he said, what should I do? And the men said, listen, you got to be careful here, because your dad pushed everybody. You know, we're talking about the north and the south. People were in the south in Jerusalem with the temple. Solomon had them come and build the temple, build the palace. But because there was such glory on Solomon, people were willing to do it. David was a really big historical figure, and people really wanted to honor him because of all that he went through. But now with Rehoboam, he didn't have that reputation. He didn't have that behind him. And the men were saying, you know, they did it for Solomon. They would come south. They would do whatever it took. They would make it because of the glory that was in this dynasty that was going on. But now with Rehoboam, the older men were saying, no, you need to really be nice to him. Take it easy. Don't push him. So Rehoboam goes to his friends, his peers, and he says, hey, well, what do you guys think? The young guys are with him. And the young guys said, listen, you need to be hard on them, and you need to be really tough on them to take authority, because they're not going to honor you or believe you. So what happens? And he had a little, actually, the young men had a vulgar term that they did. He tells them that your thumb should be thicker than your dad's loins, which is pretty intense. What they meant by that. And so Rehoboam says, I'm going to listen to the younger men. So he was really hard on them and told them, you know, I'm going to be really hard on you, and this is what I'm going to do. And so what happens, everybody throws up their hands and they said, well, what are we to do with Israel? And then they said, back to your tents. So everybody left. They went back to their tents. The 10 nations left and went back to their tents. Rehoboam ends up with Jerusalem, and he ends up with the southern kingdom with 2 tribes, and he has Benjamin and Judah. Now, Judah and Benjamin. Benjamin was a small group, and I believe that was because back in Judges, when Benjamin acted up near the end of Judges, you read about this, Benjamin acted up, and what they had to do was they asked him to please, you know, let's honor the other tribes, but they did some things, and so they killed them off. The other tribes killed them off, and what they ended up with was trying to help them repopulate. So Benjamin was a rather small land-wise, and it was small because it was small in tribe as well. So what happens here? Rehoboam, it continues on, and he has the 2 tribes, and he's in the south. He has the temple. Well, Jeroboam didn't want the people to have to go south to sacrifice. So what did Jeroboam do? Jeroboam decides he's going to have a temple there. And what he says to everybody, look, we're going to do what brought you out of Egypt. We're going to start having calf worship. So Jeroboam ends up starting to have calf worship. He carries all the way through. Every king carries it through all the way with calf worship. That's what the sins of Jeroboam are. The sins of Jeroboam were the calf worship that were like back in Egypt when they came out of Egypt and they had calf worship. Jeroboam never got the memo that calf worship wasn't okay when they came out of Egypt. Somehow he didn't hear that. But so what happened was there were a lot of Levites that jumped ship. They're like, we can't do that. And they left. They went south. They were like, we can't do that. We know Rehoboam is a tough guy, but we cannot stay here and sacrifice. So what did Jeroboam do? He had to make priests out of people who were not called to be priests. And it was really just offensive all the way across because he was not following the law of what he needed to do. Now, there were several dynasties in the northern kingdom, and there was only one dynasty in the southern kingdom. This dynasty here in the southern kingdom was from David all the way. It was all family, family, family. In the northern kingdom, there were several dynasties. As you see, everything is red. Why is it red? These were all evil because they continued with the sin of Jeroboam. They continued to not love God and love people. Everybody was putting God in a box. Temple was their box. God was saying continually, even from Deuteronomy, this was supposed to be a heart thing. Writing the word on the heart was supposed to be a heart thing. But what ended up happening was, as long as they had temple and they were doing the things, the programs, the people were satisfied, thinking that was enough. That was not God's heart. As you see, we have a few good kings in the south because they were trying to do the right thing. We've got Asa and Jehoshaphat, and we've got several along the southern kingdom. Now notice this. You notice Elijah and Elisha come on here, and Joel. Several people put him here at this time frame. I put him a little further down in the timeline. But notice that when these prophets come and are speaking to certain kings at the time. See the prophets as they're talking, as things are good and bad, you can see they're speaking, and you see how the effect that they had on the people and what had happened as they were speaking to them. Now, as you're looking at this, we realize that some things are happening here. Right here is the end of the northern kingdom. It's 722 BC. Now, what happened at the northern kingdom? The Lord had tarried long in kindness and mercy with the northern kingdom, but Assyria comes in, and Assyria starts to take over the entire area of the Middle East at this time. So Assyria comes in, and they're very cruel, very cruel. I mean, they impaled them on sticks. They did terrible things, smacked babies on walls, and just did horrible punishments. But a lot of times that you're going to see the punishment is equal to what it is that people were dishing out. What you sow, you reap. Okay. Now, when they came out of when Pharaoh, the things that Pharaoh encountered were things that he worshipped, the things that he put his trust into. Those were gods that he was worshiping. So those things he was punished by. So a lot of these things, the cruelty of Assyria, I believe, this is really what I believe, the cruelty of Assyria were some of the things that they did, the oppression on the lower class, and things that they did to the people of the time. So there was cruelty, great cruelty. One would almost, you marvel at Jonah's turning away, but I wonder if Jonah saw his own family being tortured or being hurt, because he was a man for his country. Even so, Jonah did speak to Nineveh. And so as he did, that was a country who was coming against Israel. So you can see why the problems existed as you look at the timeline, as you look and see who they were talking to at the time. What was happening at the south at the time? Hezekiah was happening. Hezekiah was an awesome man. Hezekiah actually fell on his knees and prayed and cried out to God, and when he did, see, the northern kingdom, it was not very far. And as he cried out to God and on the behalf of the southern kingdom, the Assyrians were knocking on the door. But what happened was they returned back, and Hezekiah's country was not terribly affected at the time. Now, what was happening though? Hezekiah did fall sick, and tradition has it. Now, this is tradition, Jewish tradition says that Isaiah, right here, was speaking to Hezekiah at the time. And so he's sick, he turns his head to the wall, and he repents before the Lord. Isaiah hears it in the spirit, comes back in, and he says, okay, basically, tradition has, Isaiah says, what's it to you? What happens to me? What's it to you? It needs to happen. So, Isaiah repents and gets married, has Manasseh. But let's finish out with Hezekiah. He gets better, but we know that he turned the corner for the southern kingdom when Assyria was knocking at the door. But if you read 2 Chronicles 32, we find that also during this time that pride entered in. He did not give, he had immense treasures and wealth. And so maybe he was thinking about Solomon, how Solomon was able to show his treasures at the time whenever he was doing it. And so Hezekiah starts to show the treasures to a Babylonian messenger who comes in and wishes him well to get well. So he shows him all the treasures, and Isaiah said, "What did you do?" And he said, I just showed him the treasures. And Isaiah said, not in your time, but in the time down the road, you will have, you're going to lose the country. The country is now going to go to Babylon because they've seen the treasures. And it says, let me read 2 Chronicles 32. It says that that many people were bringing gifts to the Lord at Jerusalem. And it says, he became mortally ill. He had all these riches of grains and everything. But it says in verse 25, Hezekiah gave no return for the benefit he received because his heart was proud. Therefore wrath came on him and Judah and Jerusalem. However, Hezekiah humbled the pride of his heart, both he and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the wrath of the Lord did not come on him in those days. And other translations will tell you that as his heart became lifted up, God backed away from him and let him show those treasures. So we have that. Hezekiah goes on. Though it turned for a season, it did not turn for the rest of the timeline. Now we see Manasseh, who was very evil. And on. We have these other kings that are coming in, the lineage of Hezekiah, who did terribly evil. And then we have Josiah, the great grandson of Hezekiah. Now, Josiah gets into the temple and he finds the law. It's been 60, 70 years since anybody had seen the law, and he finds it. He realizes, oh my gosh, we've messed up. We really have messed up. Now, as I'm telling you all this, understand, these people in the north, right here at Hezekiah's time, were carried away to Assyria. They were taken as captives to Assyria. I want to make clear before I get down the road on this one. They were taken to Assyria, and some people left. They jumped ship and went south, but a lot of them were carried away to Assyria if they weren't brutally killed or tortured. So what's left is it's just a mess in the north, right? And Assyria has control. But Assyria is really spread out now. Think about this. It's just really spread out now, and Babylon is starting to rise in power. Egypt is doing a few things too, but Babylon is starting to rise up in the Middle East in power. Now, so here we have Manasseh entering into this, and Josiah. Josiah sees the book of the law, and he realizes how far short his dad and grandfather fell and all the evil they did. They start replacing, or he starts trying to get things moved back and get the law set up. We see all these different prophets that are coming in to speak at the time. Now, notice too, we've got Nahum. Now, both Nahum and Jonah were preaching to Nineveh. Jonah, it turned around for Jonah, but they didn't. They were back to sin in Nahum's time, and Nahum delivers to them that Babylon is basically going to fall. And of course that was a joke, because at this point Babylon is rising in power. Now, Josiah is so excited about this, because Josiah is like, I'm getting everything turned around, and Huldah steps up, prophetess. She comes up and she says, too little, too late, so sad. Doesn't matter what you do, it's over. The country's gone, and you can't do anything about it. I don't know if this is true or not, but I really believe that Josiah finished well. To me, it's an encouragement during a time where, it looked hopeless, and, he didn't give up. Even though he knew where it was going, he was going to end well for his own name's sake, in the name of the Lord. His character, to me, is beautiful. And I think I pray that all of us are able to see and to end well in these things. Now, as we're looking down the timeline, we're seeing all this history come out. We're almost getting ready to close out here with this. But I want you to see one of the major sins that we have here throughout the timeline is the idea of God in a box. They put God in a temple. Notice that the northern kingdom felt like they were going to create their own temple. The southern kingdom had the temple, and they thought since they had God in the box, nobody could touch them. After the north fell, the north was saying, yeah, you fell. I mean, I'm just thinking this in my head. They're saying, yeah, you probably fell because you didn't have the right temple. But now the south had their confidence in the temple. Jeremiah even told them that. Several of the prophets would tell them, you are putting your confidence in the temple. Ezekiel, they were all saying, no, it's not about a temple. It's about loving God, loving people. All the way through, it's about loving God and loving people. This has nothing to do with God in a box and doing the rules. God never meant it that way, not even in the Old Testament. That had nothing to do with it. So here's Huldah. She tells him that. Josiah ends well. And what happens? The rest of the story is every one of the kings became puppet kings, because here Babylon defeats Egypt. Because Egypt was starting to rise in power, they defeat Egypt and reduce Judah, which is the southern kingdom, Judah and Benjamin, to a vassal state. That means they were, puppets, in other words. They were paying tributes, and they were pretty much slaves. And, at first that was okay because it was commerce, and they were making money on it. It was okay. But then they realized that it became harder and harder and tighter. What ends up happening is that at the end of the southern kingdom comes, Judah is carried off by Nebuchadnezzar. There are three exiles, and then when they return again, there'll be three trips they come back with. But the exiles right here are with Babylon. Now I want to throw this thought out. First of all, when they were carried away, the northern kingdom was carried away to Assyria. That was physical pain and torture. Yes, they did capture their God, and they did capture the temple in the north. And in the south now, Babylon was capturing the temple, because they thought back in that day, in that time, if we have the temple, we have your God, we have you. You're done. So here's what happens. The southern kingdom gets carried away to Babylon. What happened in Babylon? It was Abraham. Abraham came from the Ur of Chaldees looking for a city whose builder and maker was God. And what happens? They're going back to Babylon. Isaiah said it once, and then Jeremiah brings it home. And Jeremiah says, after they took him out of the stockades, the priests took him out of the stockades, and they're telling him, like, we've tortured you, and you're, And Jeremiah says, the worst thing he could say was, you're going back to Babylon. Why? Because that's where Abraham came from. Babylon, as if they never had a covenant. What a slap in the face. That's worse than torture. As if they don't have a covenant. One of the worst pains you could do. Physical pain, torture is one thing. Now to say as if you never had a covenant with God. What a terrible thing for Israel to have to face. They didn't want to believe it. They said, no, God is with us. Even with Ezekiel, he saw the glory leave the temple. This was a most destructive and terrible time in the history of Israel. And during this time of dispersion, during this dysphoria, during this time of all these tribes going, they never did come back. Okay, we never did see them all come back at once. Now, so here they are now in Babylon. And so to understand what happens down here, I'm just going to end this to tell you that eventually, not very long after, that's 587, in 539, Cyrus actually is taking over, and he's from Persia, and they now take over. It's almost like that Pac-Man game, if you remember that, where you have Assyria is cruel, and they take over and take the gods. And then you have Babylon, as if they never had a covenant, taking over all of the Middle East in that area, or several lands in it. Now, Persia comes in because Babylon couldn't hold the land, and Persia comes in and they take over, and they conquer Babylon, and they take what's left of Israel with it. Now, let me pause for just a second and tell you, Persia was kind of intellectual. I want to say New Agey, but they were intellectual and creative, and not as much as the Greeks were. The Greeks were even more so. But Persia was like, okay, that's okay. You can go back and build your temple. It was indifference. They didn't care. They're like, sure, it's not about your God. We just have your land. It's okay. Go back and build your temple. Have a good time with that. And what happened was people were getting eaten by lions, and they even said, go back and occupy that land because your land only knows your God. So go do that and we'll all be okay. What were they experiencing there? Indifference. Indifference from God. Like, sure, whatever you want to do, your God's not stronger than our God. Who cares? That was even more devastating. Notice all through the Bible, you'll have poetry, which is emotion, and then you'll have prose. Prose is like lack of emotion, telling you the story. And at this point, we are in that place of, sure, whatever you want to do, your God's not strong. Who are you? It's okay. Go have a big time with that. No emotion, no anything. The devastation that must have been throughout history. The devastation of your land and abuse first, and the killing and the maiming of people is one thing, and you see the thing go. The second thing was, could it get any worse? And then you see, as if we've never had a covenant with God. And then you think, oh, it can't get worse than that. Then, your God's not very powerful. It's okay. You go back and have a big time with that. We're in control. This to me is just very painful to look. But as you look back at this timeline, you see God's hand throughout it. You see his mercy. This was not an angry God all through here, judging these people, telling them they're evil and bad. This was a merciful God who kept saying, love me, love the people, love me, love the people, love me, love the people. Be kind. Take me out of a box. God's still saying that today, and may we never forget that. And I pray right now for everybody within the sound of my voice to just, Lord, let us hear that cry of relationship that you're asking for us, Lord. Father, would you